Hello, I'm Paul Sheesley, and today we're talking about what happens when your CEO counterpart's inner architecture starts bleeding into strategy and you find yourself compensating for them. I'm bringing this up for three reasons. First, because this is more common than people admit at the executive level. And a lot of leadership teams say they have communication problem, a trust problem, or a misalignment problem, when really what they have is a one leader's inner architecture distorting the system in real time. Second, because when you are more grounded as an executive in the room, it's very easy to slide into a compensatory role. And so calming people down after meetings or softening their tone, reinterpreting their meaning, trying to stabilize the fallout so the organization keeps moving. The third reason is because this does real damage over time. It confuses the team, it drains leadership capacity, it distorts accountability, and it slowly turns one executive into the informal regulator for another executive's unresolved internal material. So why me? I'm a psychotherapist and an executive coach and founder of EPC Leadership, Executive Performance Coaching. I work with CEOs and senior leaders in high pressure environments where strategy is never just strategy. It's always moving through human beings. And when a leader's inner architecture is reactive, unexamined, or unstable under pressure, it does not stay private. It shows up in decisions, alignment meetings, communication, and execution. So in this video, I want to break down how to recognize this pattern, why it becomes so costly, and what you do when you realize you are no longer just leading with your CEO counterpart. You are managing around them. So the problem is usually named, I think, too superficially. Most executives do not describe this problem accurately at first. It comes out with things like, we're not aligned, there's a communication issue, the team seems to be confused, we need to get better at messaging. Sometimes they can be emotional, or there's that sense of too much cleanup after meetings. But that language is usually too shallow for what's actually happening, because sometimes the real issue is not disagreement about strategy. It's not even disagreement about priorities. The real issue is that one executive's inner architecture is starting to shape how strategy gets interpreted, how it gets delivered, how it's defended or disrupted. Their fear shows up as urgency, or their insecurity shows up as control, or mistrust shows up as over-involvement. Their ego threat shows up as rigidity. So their unprocessed anxiety is going to show up as strategic inconsistencies. So, and if you're sitting next to them as a CEO, president, COO, or senior counterpart, you start feeling the burden of them long before anyone names it directly. You have a front row seat. You notice that meetings get weird after they speak. You notice people become hesitant or confused or reactive or guarded. And you notice that you're spending time cleaning up instead of advancing these executions. And you notice that you're no longer only working on the business, you're also working around one leader's internal instability. And so that's a real issue. So what does it look like when you start overcompensating? So this usually does not happen all at once. It creeps in. And I've seen this many times over. At first, you just help a little, right? You're like, we've known each other for so long, and this is hard for them, and I'm here and I'm explaining to other people that my counterpart is under pressure, or they didn't mean it the way that it sounded, and that feels normal, and that feels collegial, and that feels mature. But over time, your role starts changing. Now you're anticipating where they may get reactive. Now you're thinking ahead about how to protect the room from the reactions, or you're rewording things for them in real time. Uh, and now you're really translating their intent instead of being more coherent around what's actually delivered. And then you're buffering the organization from their inner architecture. And that's the shift. And so you're no longer just partnering with them, you're compensating for them. So you become their informal regulator or the translator or the calmer. And you become the one who's making the system livable after they destabilize it. And that's very important leadership moment to notice, because a lot of capable executives pride themselves on being able to hold complexity, to regulate that tension, to keep the system moving. But there's a difference between leadership containment and leadership overfunctioning. Containment helps the system to metabolize the reality, and overfunctioning is going to actually hide the reality and absorb someone else's job. And so that matters. So why? Why does that matter? Is because the inner architecture will always enter the strategy. One of the biggest mistakes leadership teams makes is acting like strategy is purely rational. It is not. Strategy always moves through people. And people bring with them histories, schemas, fears, defenses, identity needs, status sensitivity, control issues, threat processing patterns. So if your CEO counterpart experiences challenge as disrespect, then disagreement will not stay a strategic discussion. It will become relationally charged. I've seen this a lot, especially in one more recent merger where one CEO is moving into a board position, but his counterpart, the other CEO, was having a hard time helping this person navigate their inner architecture, them having 1 foot in and 1 foot out, so to speak, in their transition to the board position. And so thinking about the counterpart, if they experience ambiguity as danger, then uncertainty will not remain something to think through. It actually becomes something they try to over control. And this has also been seen in another CEO counterpart where the individual was receiving 50 messages a day just from this CEO's counterpart and how they were reacting to the environment. And so if the person has an unexamined need to be seen, for example, as the smartest, strongest, or most indispensable person in the room, then collaboration itself can become destabilized. And so these are some of the things what I mean by inner architecture. The issue is not simply personality. The issue is that their internal operating system is influencing how organizations receive the direction. And because executives are often rewarded for output or image or presence or intelligence or force, a lot of these inner architecture issues get missed for a long time. People start to categorize them as being intense or fast moving, or they're really direct, or their standards are high, or they're visionary, or, they seem to be under pressure. And sometimes that is true. But sometimes the system is being asked to organize itself around one leader's unresolved emotional process. So this is not a personality quirk. That becomes an operating condition. So the grounding executive ends up getting trapped. And so the more psychologically grounded executive is, it's often the one who's going to be trapped in the position working with the counterpart whose inner architecture is not regulated. So this happens because they can see what's happening and they have enough maturity or emotional range and organizational awareness to feel both the strategic issue and the human dynamics around it. So they start thinking, I can contain this. I know what they really mean. I can keep the team from getting spun up. I can restore the coherence after this. And, I don't want the system to fracture. I don't want to make it worse. And that all sounds very responsible. But over time, responsibility turns into compensation. And this is where good leaders can get pulled into the unhealthy roles, because now they're not just carrying their own leadership burdens, they are carrying a part of their counterparts' unprocessed burden too. And so they become the bridge between what was said and what should have been said. They become the repair function after relational damage. They become the source of reassurance for people who no longer trust that original message. And they become the one who explains the strategy in a calmer, cleaner way. So the danger is that this role often gets rewarded. People trust you more. They come to you for clarity. They see you as the stable one. They rely on you to regulate the executive system. But that also means the pattern gets underground. And so that it survives because you keep making it survivable. And that's the trap. And so there's lots of hidden costs here to overcompensating. At first, the overcompensating does feel helpful. It's short term, and it often is a reduce in panic or preservation of momentum and prevents blowups. And, it can protect a team from unnecessary confusion, but the long term costs will be enormous because it hides the real problem. The organization never gets a clean read on what is actually happening because you keep buffering the impact. So the dynamic or the dysfunction looks smaller than the reality is. The second thing, I think most important, is that it's going to drain you. You're now doing emotional labor, strategic labor, interpretive labor. You're leading your function or role and also stabilizing another executive's internal spillover. I also think it's going to weaken accountability. If someone keeps creating confusion or instability or relational fallout of some kind, but you keep cleaning it up behind the scenes, the consequences do not stay attached to the source. It's also going to create a dependence because people stop listening to the first message and wait for your version of it. And so that can start coming to you. People start coming to you essentially for the real meaning. And that can become burdensome, and it can actually be a dangerous structural sign. And then it's also going to potentially distort strategy because now the strategy is not moving through a clean leadership channel. It's going to move through an activation, cleanup, transition channel. And eventually the team starts reading leadership emotionally rather than strategically. And they stop focusing on the plan and start focusing on the room. And they start asking, how bad is it? And what did that mean? And who's upset? And is this real? And are we going to wait for such and such to give us another interpretation? And so that's when strategy is going to start getting eaten up by the climate. And so again, it's going to have a trickle down effect on the organization. Because when one executive's inner architecture starts running strategy, and another executive compensates for it, the organization is going to begin to split its attention. Officially, everyone is following the plan. Unofficially, everyone is adapting to the emotional field around the plan, around the leaders. So that is a very different organization. You will start to see mixed signals and hesitation, second guessing. There's a relationship management instead of like direct execution. And people start checking tone before they really start collaborating to the content. And senior leaders are now spending too much time managing reactions instead of making decisions. So the organization looks functional, the deck's polished, the meetings are happening, obviously the strategy is being announced, but the structure, although looks align, the lived experience of the organization is different. People do not trust consistency. They start filtering messages by mood and personality. They become more political because the environment feels less coherent, and execution slows down because people are trying to manage interpretation. Waste of time. This is one of the reasons organizations look more aligned from the top than they feel from the middle. And so, on paper, so to speak, the strategy exists. In the nervous system of the organization, it does not feel coherent or clean. And that gap does matter. So there's a difference between support versus absorption. And this is where I think executives need a very clean distinction. It is appropriate to support your counterpart. It's appropriate to help the system stay stable. It's appropriate to be thoughtful about timing and communication and human impact. It is not appropriate to become the permanent absorption point for another executive's unmanaged internal life. That is not partnership. That is true distortion. You can be supportive without becoming compensatory. So supporting things are going to sound like, I will help us think clearly, or I will help the team with complexity, or I will help bring steadiness. The absorption will feel and sound like, I'm going to metabolize what you don't manage, or I'll repair what you destabilize. I'll translate what you should have delivered clearly. I'll take on the secondary labor so the system doesn't feel the full cost. That second stance may keep things moving for a while, but it undermines long-term integrity and ultimately will affect that relationship, because the organization only works when one executive is constantly correcting the other, and then the leadership system's not actually healthy, and it's being artificially propped up. And I'm not saying this person is not pulling at their weight. What I'm saying is that because of their inner architecture, there is this need to overcompensate for the incoherence or the mixed messages, or the inability to support the original message. And so what do you do when you realize this is happening? So first, you have to name it accurately to yourself. You have to be able to call it. Don't keep calling it a messaging problem if you know it's deeper than that, because you'll feel it. If the same distortions keep showing up, then the issue is not isolated communication. It's a pattern. We're looking for the patterns. And you need to see the pattern clearly before you can lead around it effectively. The second thing you want to do is separate the signal from the noise. What here is truly strategic? What here is my counterpart's inner reaction? What is real business pressure and what is psychological pressure? What is the organization actually being asked to do, and what is being asked to emotionally accommodate? That separation is huge, because if you do not make it, you will keep trying to solve the internal turbulence with structural edits that never quite fix the problem. And then we also want to reduce invisible repair work. This does not mean becoming reckless or exposing the organization unnecessarily. It means you become more intentional about what you repair, why you repair it, and whether your repair work is actually helping the system or just protecting the pattern. And so fourth, we have to have the adult executive conversation. Not a shaming conversation, not a diagnostic takedown, and not you're the problem. Something like, I'm noticing that some of our conversations are being received through tension that is not just about the work. I'm also noticing that I'm spending a lot of time restabilizing interpretation and impact after some of these key moments, and that's becoming hard for me, even operationally an issue. And that's a very different conversation. It's a grounded, in effect, in pattern, in leadership burden, in organizational reality, because you want to protect your role integrity. You have to ask yourself, what is actually my job here? What leadership burden is mine, and what burden have I slowly taken on that is not mine? Where have I become indispensable for unhealthy reasons? That's a hard question for high capacity leaders, because what often makes you effective is the same thing that makes you vulnerable to overfunctioning. And so the bigger lesson here is not just about your CEO counterpart, it's about leadership systems in general. Leaders do not just bring plans into organizations, they bring themselves. Their inner architecture becomes part of the strategic environment, and a leader cannot distinguish threat from reality. They will create noise. And if they can't regulate, they will create control patterns. And they can't metabolize change, it'll distort collaboration. A leader who cannot tolerate ambiguity will make the organization more rigid than the strategy requires. And then someone else usually pays the tax. And often it's the team or you and the culture. So this is why the matters so much, is because leadership problems are very often not just competency issues, they're integration problems. The external role looks strong, but the internal structure could be weak. And the gap between those things becomes an organizational burden. And so again, the point is not to shame them. The point is to stop disappearing inside the workload. I want to be careful here. The point is not to turn this into a character indictment of your counterpart, because every leader has an inner architecture. Every leader gets activated. Every leader has pressure points, identity, sensitivities, blind spots. This is not perfection. The issue is whether these patterns are being managed responsibly enough that they do not become a hidden force in strategy. And if they are not, the answer is not for you to disappear inside the permanent workload. So this is what many strong leaders do. They become so good at containing the system that they stop noticing how much of themselves is being consumed by the containment. They do not realize that they are no longer just leading, they're holding up structure that should not require that much private repair. And that's why this topic matters. Because sometimes the bravest thing an executive can do is to stop overfunctioning long enough to see a system honestly. Not dramatically or destructively, not with ego, but clearly. And from that clarity, real leadership becomes possible again. So a takeaway is, when your CEO counterpart's inner architecture starts becoming out in strategy, the temptation is to compensate, to translate, to smooth, to calm, to reinterpret, keep the system feeling full. And in the short, that may look like leadership. But over time, if you keep becoming the translator or the buffer, you're no longer simply partnering. You're absorbing the burden that distorts accountability. And that's going to drain your capacity, and it's going to weaken the integrity of the leadership system. So the real work is to recognize the pattern, separate what's strategic from what's psychological, and stop disappearing in the work around the person and the lead from the clearer role. Because strategy does not fail only on paper. It fails when people carrying it are not integrated enough to carry it cleanly. And this is the kind of work I care most about, where inner architecture, strategic alignment, and adaptive leadership all collide in real organizational life. Thanks for listening.